105.5 WDHA here on the Jersey Magazine. I'm Jim Monahan. My guest, he's a local boy, if you consider Westchester County local. Went to Scarsdale High School, played baseball there and at Franklin and Marshall. Also now a world-class performance trainer, performance enhancement specialist, and physical therapist. That's quite the buildup. Nick Rolnick, good morning and welcome.
Wow, I really I hope I live up to the hype, but thanks for having me.
I wanted to talk to you about a number of different things. We deal a lot with youth sports and high school sports here on the Jersey Magazine for both players, coaches, and parents. You're known as the human performance mechanic. How did you get into that? What sparked your interest in that, Nick?
Well, I've really been, the more I learn about the human body and the more I learn about strength science and rehabilitation in particular, as I, by trade, I'm a physical therapist. I've really come to base my philosophy on two things. The first is that I've loved the concept of balance and how the human body in balance is something that ultimately everybody wants to or should want to achieve, because at the end of the day, pain is something that we don't really want, right? So pain is just a symptom of the body that's out of balance. And so my job as the human performance mechanic is to scan the body for potential signs of imbalances, which could be something like pain, but really it could just be feeling that you're just feeling off for one reason or another. And then my job is to look through the body and try to identify those imbalances to bring the body back to balance.
Now, did this come about as, from dealing with your own injuries, say in high school or college?
As a competitive bodybuilder back in my day, I have had my fair share of injuries from weightlifting, but also in my days as a baseball player, I was suffering from chronic shin splints with all the sprinting that we were doing in our preparation. And, it really has just been up until the last, 5 to 6 years was like, accepting the potential for pain or discomfort in movement. And it really wasn't until I spent time in my studies as a physical therapist to really understand and appreciate that when the body is in balance, there's really, there should be no pain. And so that's kind of where the mechanic idea came about, because when you're, like, for example, when you're your car is broken down and you need to take it to a mechanic, that mechanic does a systematic and screening process to then find where the problem is and then provide the solution. And so I view the same type of evaluative procedure when I work with people that are looking to recover from an injury or optimizing their performance when they're healthy. So that's where the mechanic idea came in.
Baseball players, we're seeing that getting bigger and stronger and faster more than ever before, I think. And, weights were always kind of secondary. Certainly when I was growing up, baseball players, we never got into the weight room. It was always some of the other sports. That's changed. When did you see that changing?
It's been a relatively, recent in terms of history, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, that thought process has kind of migrated from weightlifting is going to make you tighter and thus interfere with your ability to throw a baseball or be able to deliver the force for a swing, that rotational force, as we've kind of learned more about the importance of rotational acceleration and the base level of conditioning that's required to keep healthy throughout a sports season. I feel that that's where the strength science has kind of evolved and now met the expectations of the baseball player, because we're now seeing studies that show weightlifting actually augments performance and it doesn't take away performance.
You actually kind of anticipated the question that I was going to ask you. In season versus off-season weight training. I just finished a spring high school season here in New Jersey, and one of the things that started to crop into my mind was we need to get these kids generally in the weight room more, but What about an in-season program, which the school has never had in the past? What are your thoughts on that? Weightlifting in season for maintenance purposes versus off season?
Great question. I think that when we talk about in season, right, the priority is obviously sports performance, but we can't forget, even though the seasons are relatively short in high school and even collegiate athletics compared to the major leagues, right? That we need to understand that we still need to strength train in some capacity. It doesn't need to be the volume of strength training that can occur in the off season, because you want to keep at the very minimum, you want to keep that base level of conditioning that you have developed in the off season. Because unfortunately, the human body has evolved to a use it or lose it mentality. So even though we've developed the muscle mass, we developed the strength, we developed the power, which is really important in creating that acceleration force that's going to help us throw a ball harder or be able to hit a ball further. If we don't continue to stimulate those same neural pathways, we're going to lose that capacity to create those changes. So I think that there is a slight difference between what you would do in the in-season and then what you do in the off-season.
With that also in mind, what age do you recommend starting with weight training?
I am very biased toward a model of physical activity, regardless of the age. I think that the current position stand of the American Academy of Pediatrics and other prominent industry leading, professional groups have really come out strongly in support of weightlifting in the adolescent athlete. We have evidence that shows that it doesn't stunt bone growth. It doesn't stunt any of the normal processes of going through puberty. And thus, I think, though, that there needs to be a paradigm shift when we talk about the differences in focus from an adult athlete to an adolescent athlete. In that, with adolescent athletes, all we want them to do, in my opinion, is to gain an appreciation for exercise and weightlifting. And that means making it fun, right? Working on body competency, where your body is in space, understanding what needs to be done in a particular lift. And that sets, in my opinion, the foundation for a lifelong appreciation of exercise, and ultimately could set the stage for high levels of performance as they get older.
We're talking with Nick Rolnick this morning here at 105.5 WDHA on the Jersey Magazine. Before we came on, I was saying to you that I've been coaching a club team this summer, and they're 12-year-olds. And I have a variety of different sizes of kids on the team. And there's one kid, his baseball IQ, Nick, is off the charts. He's probably the smartest kid on the team. He's also the smallest kid on the team. And his dad has some size. So I keep telling him, you're not always going to be this size, and 2 years from now, when you go to take that first day of school picture that mom always takes. And he laughed. I said, you're going to have a different body. You're going to look totally different. So, I think of, weight training, for example, for that kid and what he should be doing with him, like with those kids. I'm more inclined to do a lot of self-weight exercises than I would with any kind of weights. What are your thoughts on that?
I think any approach that we can foster a positive attitude and experience with movement is extremely beneficial. I mean, as a country, absent of performance athletics, we are dealing with an overweight and obesity crisis that likely has been accelerated from the COVID-19 pandemic. For me, as somebody who understands on a much deeper level that muscle is not necessarily just beneficial for aesthetics and performance, it also is beneficial for optimizing your longevity, because the muscle actually helps with regulating our inflammation in our system that is characteristic of chronic disease. So anytime that we're in a position to work with younger individuals, I always make it an effort to make it fun, whatever that may be. That could be working on technique with unweighted drills. That is totally fine, because those squat patterns, those hip hinge patterns, those rotational patterns are all fundamental to when we actually start to put weight on. So I think that, yeah, I would totally agree with that approach.
We're talking with Nick Rolnick this morning on the Jersey Magazine at 105.5 WDHA. One of the concerns that I have, and I want to stay in the baseball realm for a second, is we're developing more and more throwers these days, as opposed to maybe a pitcher. We're developing guys who are looking about how far can I hit this ball, which is more like an exit velocity type thing. Nick, it's to the point where we're getting measurements of exit velocities of foul balls. I know chicks dig the long ball. I know that when it comes to college recruiting, they're looking for kids who throw 90 plus. I just went through this process with my son a few years ago. Sat 83, had a really, really good curveball, topped out occasionally at 85. The best looks he were getting were small D3s. And it was pretty frustrating for him. You know, this whole chasing velocity, whether it's exit velocity off the bat or throwing velocity, I'm getting concerned for the future health of the sport.
It's definitely a problem when we're looking for the big long ball, or we're looking for that 100-mile-an-hour fastball. I always go back to the Greg Maddoxes of the world that were positioning the ball versus how fast it's going. And for me, someone who has hit at a pretty decent level when I was growing up, with some people who are actually now, you know, in professional baseball, it's not sexy to throw, you know, 82, 83, but if you can position that, I don't see how they can't be any less effective than somebody that's throwing, 95 miles an hour. And so really, for me, it comes back to, how are we setting our adolescent athletes up for success in the long run? As they're going through and getting into this scouting-based program, people are doing travel teams and then travel teams on top of that, and they're not giving their body a chance to rest and adapt. And therefore, that has been thought to be one of the main reasons why there is this huge epidemic of Tommy John surgery, because these athletes now are basically overstressing their ulnar ligament, which in throwing, it is significantly stressed, but not giving the body enough time to adapt, creating an imbalance, and ultimately an imbalance that results in surgery. What's more scary to me are that athletes are getting this surgery expecting to come back throwing harder. And I think this prophylaxis type approach is really going to hurt the sport in the long run.
It's funny you mentioned that. I heard a kid, he was joking last night, and he was younger than the team that I've been coaching this summer. And he said something about Tommy John surgery and coming back throwing harder. I'm like, wow, this kid is way too young to even have that thought in the back of his head. How do you see the whole one sport versus multi-sport thing playing out here, Nick?
If I would have a child, which I don't have any right now, one of my areas of interest is in motor control of learning, right? And motor control theory. And what that just means in English is that our body needs variability in order to optimally adapt, particularly when we're young and we're growing. And what that means from the application perspective is, I want people to play multiple sports, because that allows, as the body is growing and our bones are forming, that allows us to vary the stimulus, such that for me, when I play baseball all the time, my external rotation on my throwing arm is so much greater than my external rotation on my non-throwing arm. And that's because my bones have adapted to the stress. What we're finding is the more professional athletes are coming up, they're actually multi-sport athletes. They have that variability in their system. So we're not just fine wired to one particular pattern. So I feel strongly that as long as possible, that individuals engage in multiple different sports to help our full body development.
One of the other things I wanted to talk to you about that I found on your website was blood flow restriction. Tell our listeners about that.
Well, I think it's important to first give context to why we would use blood flow restriction training. And I give the example of Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the 70s. You familiar with Arnold and his bodybuilding days? Well, he was all about the pump. And the pump is this feeling of fullness in the muscle when you're really exerting yourself during exercise, like the skin is stretching. It's almost a euphoric feeling. Well, what we thought we could only achieve that pump, which is the stimulus for our body to grow muscle and improve our strength. We thought up until about a decade and a half ago that you really could only use moderate to heavy weights in order to be able to get that effect. Well, with blood flow restriction training now, we use a cuff that we put, like getting your blood pressure taken. And what that does is it can create that pump with little to no weights. So we can replicate high intensity strength training, but without all the heavy loads.
I actually did a form of that. I had knee surgery a year and a half or so ago. And so as part of the prehab and the post-surgery rehabilitation process was doing it, I have to tell you, I hated it. But I also have to tell you, it works. I was blown away. It really does. I hated it, but it worked.
And then that's the typical reaction that I had in my experience, where you would be classified when I teach other physical therapists, you'd be classified as a battler type, where you hated it, but you saw the benefit and you reap the reward, which could be improved muscle mass, decreased pain, improved cardiovascular capacity. There's a host of other cool benefits that we can leverage with little to no weights while using this type of technology.
Nick, for WDHA listeners who want to learn more about you and what it is that you do, where's the best place for them to go?
So my first place that I would recommend anybody to go is my website at www.thehpmny.com. And that can find a little bit more about who I am and everything. And then the second place where I'm really active in talking all things health, fitness, blood flow restriction training, and rehabilitation is on Instagram. And that's the HPM, short for the Human Performance Mechanic. And I'm very active, and I'd be very pleased if you mentioned this interview to talk to you about optimizing your own health and potentially finding some balance in your system if you feel like you're out of balance.
Once again, that website is thehpmny.com and on Instagram at thehpm. Nick Rolnick, thank you for joining us this morning here in the Jersey Magazine. I've enjoyed our time together and the conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate your time and hope your listeners found some value from that.